July 22nd, 1298. William Wallace, the man who'd humiliated England at Stirling Bridge, stood with 15,000 Scots in 4 massive hedgehogs of spears, watching 2,000 English soldiers march toward certain death against his impenetrable wall of pikes. By sunset, 10,000 Scotsmen lay dead in the mud. Wallace was fleeing for his life, and Edward the Horse had just invented a new way to kill that would dominate warfare for the next 200 years. Think about those numbers. 15,000 defenders in unbreakable formations, slaughtered by 2,000 attackers in 6 hours. This wasn't just a battle. It was the birth of modern combined arms warfare. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will shatter everything you thought you knew about medieval combat. First, the weapon that turned Wallace's genius formation into a death trap. Second, the 17-minute massacre that killed more men than Stirling Bridge without a single sword being drawn. And third, why Edward's victory at Falkirk actually guaranteed England would lose Scotland forever. But here's what makes this truly insane. How did the formation that destroyed English cavalry at Stirling Bridge become a killing ground at Falkirk? What did Edward see that every other medieval commander missed? Why did Wallace's own nobles abandon him in the middle of the battle? And how did 2,000 men kill 5 times their number in a single afternoon? To understand how Edward the Rye rewrote the rules of war, we need to go back to the moment when Scotland thought it had already won. September 11th, 1297. Stirling Bridge. William Wallace and 10,000 Scots had just done the impossible. They'd shattered a professional English army, killed the kingdom's treasurer, and sent Edward I's garrison commanders fleeing south in terror. The victory was so complete, so shocking, that all of Scotland erupted in rebellion. English-held castles surrendered without a fight. Nobles who'd sworn loyalty to Edward suddenly remembered they were Scottish. And in the space of 3 months, Wallace went from outlaw to guardian of Scotland, the man who'd proven that England could bleed. But victories create expectations, and expectations create pressure. By summer 1298, Edward I was coming north with the largest army England had assembled in a generation. And Wallace was about to discover that winning one battle doesn't teach you how to win a war. The casualty figures from Stirling Bridge were staggering. Wallace's forces killed approximately 5,000 English soldiers, half the army Edward's commanders had brought north. Among the dead was Hugh de Cressingham, the English treasurer of Scotland, whose body the Scots reportedly flayed and cut into pieces as trophies. Wallace himself allegedly made a sword belt from Cressingham's skin. The survivors fled so fast, they abandoned their baggage train, siege equipment, and enough weapons to arm another 2,000 men. English garrisons across Scotland, hearing the news, evacuated their posts before Wallace even arrived. The psychological shattering was more devastating than the physical casualties. Within 6 weeks, Wallace controlled everything north of the Forth. Stirling Castle, the most important fortress in central Scotland, surrendered in November without a serious siege. English-held towns like Dundee, Perth, and Aberdeen either capitulated or were abandoned by garrisons that decided survival beat honor. By December 1297, Wallace was conducting punitive raids into northern England itself, burning Northumberland, pillaging villages, sending the message that Scotland wasn't just defending anymore. The outlaw who'd murdered an English sheriff 18 months earlier was now guardian of Scotland, commander of a phantom army that had materialized from nowhere and driven England out. It was the greatest military upset in living memory. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you about Wallace's position in early 1298. His army didn't actually exist as a standing force. Those 10,000 men at Stirling Bridge were farmers, craftsmen, and minor nobility who'd gathered for a single battle. and then gone home. Medieval Scotland lacked the taxation system, bureaucracy, or feudal structure to maintain professional soldiers year-round. Every time Wallace needed troops, he had to summon them fresh from their farms and villages, convince them to leave during planting or harvest season, and hope they'd show up. Sometimes 15,000 arrived, sometimes 6,000. His army was a constantly shifting mob of part-time warriors who fought when convenient and went home when it wasn't. Think about that. Wallace was defending an entire kingdom with forces that dissolved and reformed like morning fog. Edward I heard about Stirling Bridge while campaigning in Flanders. He returned to England in March 1298 with murder in his heart. The writs went out in April. Every landholder who owed military service was called. Every town was taxed for supplies. Edward was assembling a force specifically designed to erase Wallace from history. 200 heavy cavalry, 12,000 professional infantry, 2,000 Welsh longbowmen who'd spent years mastering their craft during Edward's brutal conquest of Wales, and a baggage train carrying enough supplies for a 3-month campaign. The numbers were overwhelming. Wallace had beaten an English army of 10,000 through tactical brilliance and terrain advantage. Edward was bringing 16,500 soldiers, 60% larger than the force Wallace had already defeated. And all of them were professionals, not feudal levies serving their 40 days and going home. By June 1298, Scottish scouts reported the nightmare moving north. Edward's army crossed the border and advanced like a flood. Towns evacuated ahead of its approach. Farms were abandoned. The English weren't raiding. They were occupying, moving slowly, methodically, destroying everything that could supply Wallace's forces. Crops burned. Livestock was slaughtered. Wells were poisoned. Edward understood siegecraft, and he was applying siege principles to an entire country. Cut off supplies, starve the enemy, make resistance impossible. Wallace, now responsible for defending a kingdom that barely had a functioning government, faced an impossible calculation. He couldn't match Edward in open battle. The numbers were suicidal. 15,000 part-time Scottish militia against 16,500 English professionals. But if he retreated into the Highlands and avoided combat, his army would dissolve from desertion, his authority would collapse, and English control would be restored without Edward even needing to fight. The Guardian of Scotland was trapped between military annihilation and political suicide. And riding at the head of that English army, Edward the Frimmers, 59 years old, called Longshanks by his soldiers and the Hammer of the Scots by his enemies, was about to teach Wallace a lesson in the difference between winning a battle and commanding a war. The king who'd spent 40 years crushing rebellions had studied exactly how Wallace won at Stirling Bridge, and he'd figured out how to ensure it never happened again. Edward I wasn't just angry about Stirling Bridge. He was methodical about revenge. At 59 years old, he'd spent 4 decades crushing rebellions in Wales, subduing barons, and building the most sophisticated military machine in Western Europe. His soldiers called him Longshanks for his height. His enemies called him the Hammer of the Scots. And that wasn't metaphor, it was prophecy. In the spring of 1298, Edward issued writs across England, Wales, and Ireland, demanding troops, supplies, and wagons. By June, he'd assembled a force that made Wallace's army at Stirling Bridge look like a militia. 2,500 heavy cavalry, 12,000 infantry, including 2,000 Welsh longbowmen, whose reputation preceded them like a curse. These weren't feudal levies forced to fight for 40 days before going home. These were professionals, paid soldiers who'd spent years in Wales learning how to destroy rebellions. And Edward had one advantage, Wallace didn't. He understood that wars aren't won by bravery alone. They're won by logistics, discipline, and knowing exactly how to kill your enemy. The composition of Edward's invasion force was designed specifically to counter everything Wallace had done at Stirling Bridge. The 2,500 heavy cavalry weren't just armored knights. They were organized into tactical units called lances, each consisting of a knight, 2 squires, and several mounted sergeants. Total, approximately 8,000 mounted troops when you counted support personnel. These men trained together, fought together, and had spent years in Wales learning to operate as coordinated formations rather than individual glory seekers. Their horses were destriers, war horses bred for size and aggression, capable of carrying a fully armored man and still hitting a charge at 20 miles per hour. Each horse cost more than a peasant family earned in 5 years. But here's what made Edward's army truly revolutionary: those 2,000 Welsh Longbowmen. These weren't supplementary troops or castle defenders. They were Edward's primary killing instrument, recruited from the same Welsh valleys that had resisted English conquest for decades before Edward crushed them in the 1280s. The longbow they carried was a 6-foot yew weapon with a draw weight of 100 to 150 pounds. So powerful it took 10 years of training, starting in childhood, to build the muscle memory and upper body strength needed to use it effectively. Archaeological evidence from medieval archers shows their skeletons were deformed from the stress. Enlarged left arms, twisted spines, bone spurs on their fingers. These men had literally reshaped their bodies to become weapons, and they could fire 6 arrows per minute with accuracy up to 200 yards. Think about that. 2,000 archers firing 6 times per minute equals 12,000 arrows in the air every 60 seconds. Wallace had faced heavy cavalry at Stirling Bridge. He had no idea what massed archery looked like. Edward's logistics were equally terrifying. His baggage train stretched for miles, hundreds of wagons carrying grain, salted meat, arrows, replacement weapons, horseshoes, nails, rope, canvas for tents, medical supplies, and mobile forges for repairing armor. He'd contracted with merchants in Berwick and Newcastle to supply his army via coastal ships, creating a mobile supply line that didn't depend on raiding the Scottish countryside. This wasn't a raid. It was an occupation force designed to stay in the field for months. More importantly, Edward had studied Stirling Bridge. He'd interviewed survivors, read reports from his commanders, and identified exactly why Wallace won. The Scots had used terrain, a narrow bridge that forced English cavalry into a bottleneck where they couldn't maneuver. They'd used timing, waiting until half the English army was across before attacking, dividing the force. And they'd used pike formations that turned defensive infantry into an impenetrable wall. Edward's tactical solution was elegant and brutal. Don't engage Wallace on his terms. Use archers to break his pike formations from range, then use cavalry to finish survivors. Combined arms warfare, coordinating infantry, cavalry, and missile troops to compensate for each weakness. No European army had perfected this doctrine yet. Edward was about to write the textbook. Here's where it gets genuinely insane. Edward was so confident in his systematic approach that he publicly announced his invasion route and timeline. No deception, no surprise attacks. He wanted Wallace to know he was coming, wanted him to gather his army and stand and fight, because Edward had built a military instrument specifically designed to destroy schiltrons in open battle. This wasn't war. It was a demonstration. By late June 1298, Edward's army crossed the border at Roxburgh and began the slow, methodical advance north. Scouts ranged ahead, mapping terrain. Engineers prepared roads for the baggage train. Forage parties systematically burned crops and poisoned wells, denying Wallace resources. The English moved at 10 miles per day, not because they couldn't move faster, but because Edward wanted his army to arrive fresh, supplied, and ready to fight. Wallace's scouts watched from the hills and sent riders galloping north with increasingly desperate messages. The king himself was coming, at the head of an army larger than anything Scotland had seen since Stirling Bridge, and he was advancing like a glacier, slow, unstoppable, and crushing everything in his path. By July 1298, Wallace faced a problem that had destroyed every Scottish resistance leader before him. He couldn't feed his army. The English scorched earth campaign through southern Scotland had torched crops, slaughtered livestock, and poisoned wells. Wallace's 15,000 men were eating through supplies faster than foraging parties could replace them. Worse, Edward's fleet controlled the coast, cutting off any hope of resupply from France or Norway. Wallace had two options: retreat into the highlands and watch his army dissolve from starvation and desertion, or stand and fight on ground he didn't choose, against an enemy that outnumbered and out-equipped him. He chose to fight, because Wallace understood something that Edward was betting on. If the Guardian of Scotland ran from battle, the rebellion would collapse from shame before it collapsed from hunger. On July 21st, Wallace positioned his army near Falkirk, in rolling terrain south of the Antonine Wall, and waited. He didn't know that Edward's scouts had already found him. The English were 12 miles away and marching fast. The supply mathematics were brutal and simple. An army of 15,000 men consumes approximately 15 tons of food per day: bread, oats, salted meat, anything edible. Add in horses. Wallace had maybe 1,000 cavalry mounts plus draft animals, and you're burning through 20 tons of supplies daily. Wallace's foraging parties were scouring the countryside for 20 miles in every direction, stripping farms that had already been stripped by English advance forces. By mid-July, the army was on half rations. By July 20th, men were deserting in groups of 50 and 100, slipping away at night to return to their villages before starvation took them. Wallace was losing approximately 500 men per day to desertion alone. Let that sink in. His army was dissolving not from combat, but from simple hunger. Edward's coastal blockade made the situation impossible. English ships patrolled the Firth of Forth and the North Sea, intercepting any supply vessels from France or Norway. Wallace had sent envoys to Philip IV of France and King Haakon V of Norway, begging for military aid, money, anything. The replies were sympathetic and useless. Diplomatic support, yes, but no troops, no ships, no supplies. Scotland was alone, and Edward knew it. His intelligence network had infiltrated Wallace's camp with paid informants, Scottish nobles who decided cooperation with England was safer than resistance. Every supply shortage, every desertion, every argument among Wallace's commanders was reported back to English headquarters within days. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about Wallace's decision to stand at Falkirk. It was military suicide disguised as tactical necessity. Wallace had approximately 15,000 men, down from 18,000 a week earlier due to desertion. Edward had 16,500 fresh, well-supplied professionals. Wallace's cavalry consisted of maybe 1,000 Scottish nobles, many of whom barely tolerated his leadership and some of whom were actively negotiating with Edward's agents. Wallace's archers numbered fewer than 1,000, poorly equipped, using hunting bows that couldn't match English longbows in range or penetration. His infantry were farmers with pikes, brave, disciplined at Stirling Bridge, but untested against combined arms warfare. The odds were catastrophic, but retreating meant political annihilation. If the Guardian of Scotland fled without fighting, every noble who'd sworn allegiance after Stirling Bridge would defect back to England within a week. The rebellion would implode. So Wallace chose ground near Falkirk and prepared to make Edward pay for victory. The terrain was rolling hills with patches of boggy ground, not ideal, but it would slow English cavalry charges. Wallace deployed his army in 4 massive schiltrons, the circular pike formations that had destroyed English knights at Stirling Bridge. Each schiltron contained 2,000 to 3,000 men, standing shoulder to shoulder. Their 12-foot pikes angled outward, creating an impenetrable hedge of steel. Between the schiltrons, he positioned his archers. Behind the infantry, his cavalry waited on higher ground, ready to exploit any English mistakes. The schiltrons were anchored with wooden stakes driven into the ground and connected with ropes, making them even harder to break. On paper, it was brilliant. A defensive formation designed to absorb cavalry charges and bleed the English until they gave up. But Wallace made one critical miscalculation. He'd designed his defense to stop cavalry, because cavalry had been the decisive weapon at Stirling Bridge. What he didn't account for was that Edward had spent 10 months specifically preparing to fight schiltrons. And the answer to an impenetrable pike wall isn't more cavalry. It's arrows. July 21st, evening. English scouts found Wallace's position. They counted the schiltrons, estimated troop strength, mapped the terrain, and galloped back to Edward's camp with the intelligence the king had been waiting for. Wallace had stopped running. He was dug in near Falkirk, approximately 12 miles north, in a defensive formation with his back partially to wooded terrain. Edward received the report in his command tent, studied a rough map his scouts had drawn, and smiled. Wallace had just made the last mistake of his military career. The Guardian of Dhiru, Scotland had positioned his army exactly where Edward wanted it: static, defensive, and perfectly exposed to archery fire. Edward gave the order. The army would march at first light. By noon tomorrow, Wallace's schiltrons would be target practice for 2,000 Welsh longbowmen. And by sunset, the rebellion that had started at Stirling Bridge would be drowned in Scottish blood. Wallace's tactical genius at Stirling Bridge came from one innovation: the schiltron. It was a circular formation of spearmen, packed shoulder to shoulder, with 12-foot pikes pointing outward in every direction like a massive steel hedgehog. Cavalry couldn't charge it. Infantry couldn't break through. At Stirling, English knights had impaled themselves trying to crack Wallace's schiltrons, and the few who survived had fled in terror. Now, at Falkirk, Wallace deployed 4 massive schiltrons across the battlefield, each containing 2,000 to 3,000 men anchored in boggy ground that would slow any cavalry charge. Between the schiltrons, he placed his archers, fewer than $1,000, poorly equipped, but enough to harass the English while the pike walls did the killing. Behind the infantry, Wallace positioned his cavalry, Scottish nobles on horseback, maybe 1,000 riders, there to exploit any breakthrough or cover a retreat. On paper, it was a defensive masterpiece. The schiltrons were unbreakable. The terrain was awful for cavalry. Wallace had learned from Stirling Bridge that you don't need to outfight the English. You just need to make attacking you so costly they give up. But here's what Wallace didn't know. Edward the I had spent the last year studying exactly how Wallace had won at Stirling Bridge. And he'd figured out how to kill a schiltron. The schiltron's strength came from geometry and discipline. Each formation was roughly circular, approximately 60 to 80 yards in diameter, containing between 2,000 and 3,000 men standing in concentric rings. The outer ranks held their 12-foot pikes at a 45-degree angle, creating a bristling wall of steel points. The inner ranks held pikes vertically, ready to step forward and replace casualties in the outer rings. Men stood close enough that their shoulders touched. No gaps, no weak points. The pikes themselves were ash wood shafts, tipped with iron spearheads, long enough that a charging horse would impale itself 3 ranks deep before reaching the men holding the weapons. Think about that. A war horse running at full gallop had to penetrate 9 feet of pike shafts just to reach the first line of Scottish soldiers. It was mathematically impossible. At Stirling Bridge, this formation had been devastating because the terrain forced English cavalry to attack from predictable angles across a narrow bridge. The knights couldn't maneuver, couldn't flank, couldn't do anything except charge directly into the pike walls and die. Wallace's schiltrons had held firm while his other forces slaughtered the English trapped on the north side of the river. The victory had been so complete that every Scottish commander assumed the schiltron was invincible, a formation that turned peasants with spears into an impenetrable fortress. But here's where Wallace's tactical brilliance became his fatal blindness. The schiltron was designed to counter medieval warfare's dominant weapon: heavy cavalry. For 3 centuries, armored knights had been the ultimate battlefield weapon: mobile, heavily protected, devastating in the charge. Infantry formations throughout Europe were designed either to support cavalry or die trying to stop it. Wallace had solved the cavalry problem so completely at Stirling Bridge that he'd convinced himself he'd solved warfare itself. What Wallace didn't account for was that schiltrons have one catastrophic weakness: they can't move. Once formed, the circular pike wall is locked in place. Men can't advance without breaking formation. They can't retreat without the outer ranks turning their backs to the enemy. They can't even crouch or take cover without lowering their pikes and creating gaps that cavalry could exploit. The schiltron is a static defensive position, and static positions are perfect targets for one thing: missile fire. Edward understood this immediately. His commanders had sent detailed reports from Stirling Bridge describing exactly how Wallace's formations worked. The circular shape, the overlapping pike ranks, the discipline that kept men from breaking formation even under cavalry assault. Edward had spent 10 months analyzing those reports, consulting with his veteran officers who'd fought in Wales and asking one critical question: how do you kill men who won't move and can't defend themselves from above? The answer was obvious. You don't charge them, you shoot them. Medieval longbows had an effective range of 200 yards, far beyond the reach of Scottish pikes. An archer could stand safely outside the schiltron's threat range and rain arrows down at a 45-degree angle, plunging fire that came from above rather than horizontally. And because the schiltron's men were packed shoulder to shoulder in a perfect circle, every arrow that hit the formation hit a target. There were no gaps, no cover, no way to dodge. The tighter and more disciplined the formation, the easier it was to kill. Wallace had positioned his 4 schiltrons across rolling terrain near Falkirk, each one anchored with wooden stakes driven into the boggy ground and connected with ropes, making them even more immobile than normal. He'd placed his 1,000 poorly equipped archers in the gaps between schiltrons, hoping they could disrupt English charges. What he'd actually done was create 4 enormous stationary targets containing 10,000 men who would be physically unable to take cover when the arrows started falling. Edward saw Wallace's deployment and immediately recognized what was about to happen. This wasn't going to be a battle. It was going to be an archery demonstration using Scottish soldiers as targets. And on the morning of July 22nd, 1298, as his army marched north toward Falkirk, Edward gave the order that would revolutionize medieval warfare and turn Wallace's tactical genius into a death trap. Send the Longbowmen forward. Break their formations. The cavalry will finish what's left. The night of July 21st, 1298, almost ended the war before the battle began. and not the way anyone expected. Edward's army camped 12 miles from Falkirk, exhausted from weeks of marching through hostile territory. Supplies were running critically low. The soldiers were hungry, cold, and convinced they'd marched all this way to find Wallace had vanished into the highlands. Discipline started to crack. Around midnight, Edward's warhorse, a massive destrier worth more than a knight's annual income, spooked and kicked the king in the ribs while he slept on the ground beside it. 2 ribs cracked. Edward woke in agony, gasping, unable to stand. His commanders panicked, whispering that the king was dying, that they should retreat immediately. But Edward, still lying on the ground clutching his chest, gave the order anyway. Arm the men. We march at dawn. He couldn't ride. He could barely breathe. But he understood that if his army retreated now, before even fighting, Scotland would believe England could be beaten by simply existing long enough. Meanwhile, 12 miles north, Wallace was dealing with his own crisis. His cavalry, the Scottish nobles who'd pledged their loyalty, were arguing. Some wanted to retreat. Others wanted to fight, but refused to take orders from a commoner like Wallace. And at least one, John Comyn, was already considering what rewards Edward might offer if Wallace conveniently died in battle. 2 armies, both on the verge of collapse, preparing to collide at sunrise. Edward's injury should have ended the campaign. At 59 years old with 2 cracked ribs, every breath felt like knives in his chest. His physicians, traveling with the army because medieval campaigns were mortality lotteries, examined him by torchlight and recommended immediate rest, possibly weeks of recovery. Moving could puncture a lung. Riding a warhorse was suicidal. But Edward understood something his doctors didn't. Armies are held together by perception. His soldiers had marched for 6 weeks through hostile territory, enduring short rations and constant Scottish harassment, because they believed their king would lead them to victory. If Edward retreated because of an injury, the entire army would interpret it as weakness, maybe even divine judgment. Morale would shatter. Men would desert. By the time they reached the Scottish border, half the force would be gone. So Edward made a decision that defined his reputation. At 4 a.m., he ordered his squires to bind his torso with leather straps wrapped so tightly he could barely expand his lungs, then help him into armor. The process took 30 minutes and left him sweating and pale from pain. But by 5 a.m., when the army assembled in the pre-dawn darkness, Edward the Octon sat mounted on his destrier, visibly commanding from the front. His soldiers saw their king ready for battle and stopped whispering about retreat. Think about that. A 59-year-old man with cracked ribs, in agony, chose to risk death by internal bleeding rather than let his army believe he was weak. That's not courage. That's calculated intimidation of your own troops. But here's what the English chronicles don't tell you. Edward's army was also on the verge of mutiny for a completely different reason. Supplies had run critically low. The contracted merchants who'd promised to resupply via coastal ships had failed to deliver. Whether from storms, Scottish raiders, or simple incompetence, the food wasn't arriving. By July 21st, the English army was on quarter rations. 16,500 men consuming maybe 8 tons of food per day when they needed 20. Soldiers were stealing from each other. Fights broke out over bread. Some units had started slaughtering their own horses for meat, which was military suicide because cavalry without horses is just expensive infantry. Around 2 a.m., a brawl erupted between Welsh longbowmen and English men-at-arms over a stolen sack of grain. 80 men were involved before officers broke it up with whips and threats of execution. 2 soldiers died in the fight, not from Scottish weapons, but from their own comrades' fists and knives. Edward's commanders suppressed news of the incident, but the message was clear. The army was fracturing from hunger and exhaustion. If they didn't fight soon, they'd have to retreat anyway. Not from military defeat, but from logistical collapse. 12 miles north, Wallace faces his own nightmare. His cavalry, approximately 1,000 mounted nobles led by men like John Comyn of Badenoch and John Stewart of Bonkle, are meeting in heated council behind the Scottish lines. These aren't loyal soldiers following Wallace's orders. They're feudal lords who resent taking commands from a commoner, a man with no noble blood who'd seized power through violence and charisma. Some genuinely want to fight. Others are convinced the battle is already lost and want to preserve their forces for future resistance. And at least 3, including Comyn, are secretly negotiating with English agents, trying to buy pardons and land grants in exchange for sabotaging Wallace at the crucial moment. Wallace knows about the treachery. His own intelligence network has intercepted messages. But he can't act without triggering open rebellion within his own army. So he does the only thing he can. He walks through the Scottish camp at 3 a.m., speaking quietly to his pikemen, the commoners who'd followed him since Stirling Bridge. He tells them the truth. Tomorrow, some of the nobles might flee. Some might even betray them. But if the schiltrons hold, if the common men of Scotland stand firm, they can still win. The soldiers listen. Many are terrified, but they don't desert. Not tonight. By 5 a.m., both armies are awake. The English are forming columns for the march north. The Scots are checking their pike formations one final time. 2 forces that should have collapsed from internal chaos are instead preparing for battle, because both commanders understood that retreating now would be worse than dying. At 6 a.m., English scouts confirm Wallace's position hasn't changed. He's still dug in near Falkirk, schiltrons ready, waiting. Edward gives the order to advance. And 12 miles away, Wallace watches the sun rise over his defensive positions and wonders if he'll live to see it set. July 22nd, 1298, 6 a.m. English scouts crested a low ridge 2 miles south of Falkirk and froze. There, spread across the valley, were Wallace's schiltrons. 4 massive circles of spearmen, motionless, waiting. The scouts galloped back to Edward's column with the news. Wallace wasn't retreating. He was dug in and ready to fight. Edward, still in crippling pain from his broken ribs, mounted his horse through sheer force of will and rode to the front of his army. What he saw must have looked like a nightmare designed specifically to kill cavalry. Wallace had positioned his schiltrons on boggy ground, each formation anchored by wooden stakes driven into the earth and connected by ropes. Between the schiltrons, patches of marsh made maneuvering nearly impossible. The Scottish archers stood in the gaps, ready to harass anyone who approached. And behind it all, Wallace's cavalry watched from higher ground, ready to charge if the English broke formation. Edward's commanders saw the same thing and immediately started arguing. The knights wanted to charge, honor demanded it, and besides, pikes had never stopped English cavalry before. The infantry commanders argued for a siege approach, surround Wallace, cut off supplies, starve him out. But Edward said nothing. He just studied the field, calculating distances, angles, and vulnerabilities. And then he smiled, because he'd just seen what Wallace had missed. The Scottish position looked formidable at first glance. 4 schiltrons, each containing approximately 2,500 men, deployed in a rough line across rolling terrain. Total pike strength. 10,000 soldiers locked in defensive formations that had already proven they could destroy cavalry charges. Between the schiltrons, roughly 800 Scottish archers with short bows, inferior to English longbows, but numerous enough to cause casualties if the English tried to maneuver through the gaps. Behind the infantry, Wallace's cavalry, approximately 1,000 mounted nobles, sat on higher ground, positioned to sweep down and exploit any breach in the English line. The terrain itself was hostile to attackers. Boggy patches that would slow cavalry to a crawl, making them easy targets for Scottish spears. Edward's senior commanders, Ralph de Monthermer and the Earl of Norfolk, immediately advocated for direct assault. "We outnumber them," Norfolk argued. 2,500 of our cavalry against their formations. We hit them from multiple angles simultaneously, overwhelm their front ranks, break through the gaps between their circles. The logic seemed sound. Traditional medieval doctrine said that concentrated cavalry charges could break any infantry formation through sheer momentum and shock. But Edward had read the reports from Stirling Bridge. He knew what happened when English knights charged Scottish pikes. The horses impaled themselves. The riders died in heaps at the base of the formations, and the schiltrons held. Other commanders suggested siege tactics. Surround Wallace, wait him out, let starvation do the killing. Edward's engineers calculated they could build a fortified perimeter in 3 days, cutting off Scottish escape routes and foraging parties. Within a week, Wallace's army would be eating grass. Within 2 weeks, they'd surrender or die of hunger. It was the safe, methodical approach. But Edward rejected it immediately. If we surround them and wait, his cavalry escapes tonight and the infantry scatters into the highlands. We'll have marched 6 weeks to kill nobody and capture nothing. Unacceptable. Here's where Edward's tactical genius became apparent. He dismounted, excruciating with his broken ribs, and had his cartographers spread a rough map on the ground. He studied Wallace's deployment, measuring distances with a stick, calculating angles of fire and approach vectors. Then he called for his Welsh longbow commanders. "From your position here," he pointed to a spot 250 yards from the nearest schiltron. "Can your men hit those formations?" The Welsh captain studied the distance and nodded. "Easily, my lord. At 250 yards, we can maintain plunging fire for hours. Those circles are perfect targets, no cover, men packed too tight to dodge." Edward stands, wincing from the rib pain, and turns to face his assembled commanders. What he says next will rewrite medieval warfare. "We're not charging their pikes. We're not besieging them. We're going to kill them from range using archers, then use cavalry to finish survivors. Combined arms, each element compensating for the other's weakness. The Welsh advance to effective range, deploy in formation, and fire continuously. The cavalry screens the archers from Scottish cavalry and waits. When the pike formations break from casualties, the knights charge through the gaps and destroy what's left." Think about what Edward just described. He's inverting 300 years of medieval tactics. Traditionally, archers support cavalry charges by softening enemy formations. Edward is making archers the primary weapon and cavalry the cleanup crew. His commanders look confused, some openly skeptical. The Earl of Norfolk protests. "My lord, archers have never won a major battle. They're support troops. Knights decide battles through shock combat and..." Edward cuts him off. "Knights decide battles when the enemy can move and fight back. Wallace's men are locked in static formations. They can't advance without breaking their pike walls. They can't retreat without exposing their backs. They can't even crouch or take cover without lowering their weapons and letting our cavalry through. They're not soldiers anymore. They're targets. And we have 2,000 longbowmen who can fire 12,000 arrows per minute into formations where every arrow hits a man. Let that calculation sink in. 12,000 arrows per minute into 4 circles containing 10,000 men total. That's more than 1 arrow per soldier every 60 seconds. And the Scots physically cannot take evasive action without destroying their own defensive formation. Edward has just identified the schiltron's fatal weakness. The discipline that makes it unbreakable against cavalry makes it a death trap against archery. At 7 a.m., Edward gives the order. The English army advances, not in a cavalry charge, but in a careful, measured approach with Longbowmen in the lead and heavy cavalry screening the flanks. Wallace, watching from behind his schiltrons, sees the English deployment and assumes they're preparing for a traditional assault. He orders his pikemen to brace for impact, pikes locked at 45-degree angles, formations tight. What Wallace doesn't realize is that Edward has no intention of charging. In the next 60 minutes, the Battle of Falkirk will prove that the age of the armored knight is ending, and the age of the longbow is beginning. And 10,000 Scottish soldiers standing in perfect defensive formation are about to become the demonstration. 9 a.m. Edward gave the order every knight had been waiting for. Advance. The English heavy cavalry, 2,500 armored men on war horses bred for shock combat, formed into 3 massive divisions and began moving toward the Scottish schiltrons. The ground shook. The sound of hooves was like continuous thunder. Wallace's pikemen braced, locking their 12-foot spears into the ground, creating a wall of steel points that rose at a 45-degree angle. This was the moment that had destroyed the English at Stirling Bridge. This was where cavalry died. The 1st English Division, commanded by the Earl of Norfolk, charged directly at the nearest schiltron at full gallop. 800 knights, lances lowered, smashing into the Scottish pike wall like a hammer hitting a hedgehog. And the schiltron held. Horses screamed as they impaled themselves on the pikes. Knights were thrown from their saddles, crashing into the mud in 60 pounds of armor. Men in the front ranks of the schiltron were crushed by the sheer momentum of the charge. But the formation didn't break. The 2nd wave hit. Same result. The 3rd wave hesitated, turned, and tried to find gaps between the schiltrons. But the marshy ground slowed them to a crawl, and Scottish archers in the gaps started picking off riders. Within 30 minutes, the English cavalry had achieved nothing except proving Wallace's schiltrons were exactly as lethal as advertised. But here's what happened next. Edward didn't order a 4th charge. Instead, he pulled his cavalry back, out of pike range, and gave an order that would change medieval warfare forever. The carnage from those first charges was exactly what Wallace had anticipated. English war horses, each weighing 500 pounds and running at 20 miles per hour, crashed into the Scottish pike walls with unstoppable momentum. Physics took over. The front rank of pikes, held at 45-degree angles and braced against the ground, punched through horse chests and throats. Animals screamed, a sound that soldiers who survived Falkirk would describe in nightmares for the rest of their lives. Knights were catapulted from their saddles as their mounts died beneath them, hitting the ground in full armor, 60 to 80 pounds of steel plate that turned a simple fall into a crippling impact. Some broke bones. Others were knocked unconscious. Many were trampled by the horses behind them who couldn't stop in time. English casualties from the cavalry charges were severe, but not catastrophic. Approximately 200 knights killed or seriously wounded. Roughly 300 horses dead or so badly injured they had to be put down. Think about those numbers. 300 war horses lost in 30 minutes, each one worth more than a peasant's lifetime earnings, each one requiring years of training to become a viable weapon of war. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you. Those losses were acceptable to Edward. He'd expected them. The cavalry charges weren't designed to break the schiltrons. They were reconnaissance in force, a tactical probe to confirm what Edward already suspected. The pike formations were exactly as strong as advertised. Charging them was suicide, which meant charging them again would be stupidity. Wallace, watching from his position behind the schiltrons, allows himself a moment of grim satisfaction. The formations are holding. English cavalry, the weapon that had dominated European battlefields for 3 centuries, is smashing itself to pieces against Scottish peasants with wooden pikes. It's Stirling Bridge happening again. His pikemen are standing firm, maintaining discipline under assault, proving that common soldiers properly trained and positioned can stop the most elite heavy cavalry in Europe. Some of the Scottish soldiers start cheering between waves of attack, their confidence building with each repulsed charge. But the English cavalry commanders aren't demoralized. They're confused. The Earl of Norfolk, whose division led the first charge, rides back to Edward's position expecting orders for a 4th assault, maybe from a different angle or with more concentrated force. Instead, Edward is sitting on his warhorse, studying the Scottish formations through the clearing smoke and dust, his face expressionless despite the agony from his broken ribs. Norfolk reports, "My lord, the formations are holding. We've lost 200 men and gained nothing. If we commit the reserves..." Edward cuts him off. "No more charges. Pull your divisions back to 400 yards and screen the flanks." Norfolk stares, momentarily stunned. "My lord, we can't simply withdraw. Our honor..." Edward turns to face him, and his voice is cold iron. "Your honor is intact. You charged. You proved the pikes work as advertised. Now we're going to kill those pikemen without losing another knight. Signal the Welsh Longbowmen. It's their battle now." 9:45 a.m. The English cavalry withdraws, not in retreat, but in redeployment, forming up on the flanks of the battlefield, approximately 400 yards from the nearest schiltron. Wallace watches this maneuver with growing unease. Why would Edward pull back? Why concede the field after committing so much force? The answer emerges from the English lines, like a nightmare taking shape. 2,000 Welsh longbowmen advance on foot, moving with practiced discipline into formation 250 yards from the Scottish pike walls. They're not charging. They're not even rushing. They're walking calmly into position, spreading into long ranks that extend across the entire front of Wallace's defensive line. Wallace sees them deploying and feels the first cold touch of real fear. His own archers, 800 men with hunting bows, positioned in the gaps between schiltrons, are already exhausted from harassing the cavalry charges. Their arrows can't reach 250 yards with any accuracy or penetrating power. The English longbowmen, by contrast, are fresh, carrying full quivers of 48 arrows each, armed with weapons specifically designed for war. The draw weight on those Welsh bows is 150 pounds, strong enough to punch through chainmail at 200 yards. And Wallace's pikemen, locked in their circular formations, can't take cover, can't scatter, can't do anything except stand in perfect target formations and wait for what's coming. At 10 a.m., Edward gives the order that will be studied in military academies for the next 700 years. Longbowmen, knock arrows, elevation for plunging fire, target the schiltrons, on my command, loose. 2,000 Welsh archers draw their 6-foot yew-bows to full extension. The sound is like wood creaking under impossible stress. And Wallace, standing behind his unbreakable pike formations, realizes with crystallizing horror that he's just lost the battle without his enemy ever reaching his lines. The schiltrons that saved Scotland at Stirling Bridge are about to become coffins. 10 a.m. Edward turned to his Welsh longbowmen and said 2 words: "Break them." What followed was the most one-sided massacre in medieval military history. And it happened without a single sword being drawn. The English longbowmen, 2,000 men armed with 6-foot yew-bows capable of punching through chainmail at 200 yards. advanced to within effective range of Wallace's schiltrons and began firing in coordinated volleys. The sound was unlike anything medieval warfare had produced before. Not the clash of steel or the screams of horses, but a continuous, rhythmic whisper, shwick, 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 as 2,000 arrows launched every 10 seconds. Do the math. 2,000 archers, firing 6 arrows per minute, equals 12,000 arrows in the air every 60 seconds. That's 200 arrows per second raining down on formations of men packed so tightly they couldn't move. The schiltrons, designed to stop cavalry, were perfect targets for archery. The circular formations meant there was no cover, no flanks to protect. Every man was exposed. The pikes, held vertically, did nothing to stop arrows falling from above at a 45-degree angle. And because the pikemen were locked in formation, shoulder to shoulder, unable to scatter or take cover, they could only stand there and die. Medieval longbows had a draw weight of 100 to 150 pounds, strong enough that arrows punched through leather, chainmail, and even thin plate armor at close range. A direct hit to the head or chest killed instantly. Hits to limbs shattered bones, severed arteries, left men screaming and bleeding in the mud, while their formations held firm because they physically couldn't run. After 17 minutes of sustained archery, the front ranks of Wallace's schiltrons were collapsing under the weight of their own dead. The physics of what was happening to Wallace's army was brutally simple. Each Welsh longbow arrow was a 30-inch shaft of ash wood tipped with a razor-sharp iron bodkin point, designed specifically to penetrate armor. When fired at maximum draw, 150 pounds of force, these arrows left the bow at approximately 180 feet per second. At 250 yards range, they struck with enough kinetic energy to punch through a chainmail hauberk, through the padded gambeson underneath, through skin and muscle, and into vital organs. A hit to the chest cavity was usually fatal within minutes, as lungs filled with blood. A hit to the throat or face killed instantly. Hits to arms or legs might not be immediately lethal, but they crippled men permanently. Shattered bones, severed tendons, wounds that would fester and kill from infection within days. Here's what makes the slaughter at Falkirk uniquely horrific: the target density. Each schiltron contained approximately 2,500 men standing in a circular formation roughly 70 yards in diameter. That's 2,500 human bodies packed into an area of about 3,800 square yards. Think about that density. Less than 2 square yards per man. When 12,000 arrows fall into that space every minute, the mathematical probability of a miss is nearly 0. Every arrow that entered the formation hit something. A man, a pike shaft, another arrow already embedded in a corpse. But mostly men. The Scottish pikemen can't respond. Their own archers, 800 men with short hunting bows, try to return fire, but their arrows fall short, landing harmlessly 50 yards in front of the English longbowmen. The range differential is fatal. Scottish bows have a maximum effective range of maybe 150 yards. The Welsh are firing from 250 yards, comfortably outside retaliation distance. Wallace's archers burned through their quivers in frustration, achieving nothing except wasting ammunition. Within 20 minutes, they've exhausted their arrows and fall silent. Now there's no Scottish response at all, just the continuous whisper of English bowstrings and the screams of dying men. 10:17 a.m. The front 3 ranks of the nearest schiltron have collapsed. Not broken formation, collapsed. Men are standing upright with multiple arrows in their bodies, held in place by the press of soldiers behind them, dead but unable to fall because there's no room. Others are on their knees, clutching arrow shafts protruding from their chests, begging for help that can't come because moving to assist them means breaking formation and letting English cavalry through. The ground inside the formations is slick with blood. Men are slipping, falling, unable to stand back up as boots trample them and more arrows rain down. But here's where the tragedy becomes genuinely insane. The schiltrons still hold. Wallace drilled his men so thoroughly at Stirling Bridge that breaking formation has become psychologically impossible. Every soldier knows the rule. If the circle breaks, cavalry charges through and everyone dies. So even as arrows slaughter them, even as their friends collapse bleeding at their feet, the pikemen maintain their positions. The outer ranks keep their pikes elevated at 45-degree angles. The inner ranks stand ready to step forward and replace casualties. The formation holds its shape even as it fills with corpses. Scottish commanders inside the schiltrons are screaming orders to advance, to retreat, to do something other than stand and die. But advancing means lowering the pikes and exposing the formation to cavalry charge. Retreating means turning their backs to the arrows and creating gaps. There's no tactical solution. The schiltrons have become iron cages, and the men inside them are being systematically executed by physics and geometry. Wallace watches from his command position behind the lines, his face ashen. He's just witnessed 17 minutes of combat that have killed more Scots than the entire Battle of Stirling Bridge. And the arrows are still falling. His tactical masterpiece, the formation that defeated English cavalry, has been turned into an abattoir by weapons he didn't account for and a tactic he couldn't predict. 10:20 a.m. The Welsh Longbowmen paused to retrieve fresh arrows from their supply wagons. In 20 minutes, they've fired approximately 240,000 arrows into 4 formations containing 10,000 men. Scottish casualties are approaching 3,000 dead or dying. And Edward's cavalry hasn't moved. They're just watching, waiting for the formations to break. And when they do, the real slaughter will begin. 10:30 a.m. Wallace's cavalry, 1,000 Scottish nobles on horseback, positioned behind the infantry to support the defense, made a decision that would haunt Scottish history for centuries. They ran, not forward into battle, backward, off the field, abandoning the pikemen they'd sworn to protect. The reasons were complex and cowardly in equal measure. Some nobles, like John Comyn, had never fully supported Wallace's leadership. He was a commoner, an upstart who'd seized power through violence rather than birthright. Others saw the English longbow massacre unfolding and made a cold calculation. The battle was already lost, and dying alongside peasants wouldn't change that. A few may have already been negotiating with Edward's agents, buying their survival with promises of future loyalty. Whatever their reasons, the result was catastrophic. The moment Wallace's cavalry fled, his archers, positioned between the schiltrons and completely unprotected without cavalry support, panicked and scattered. Some tried to retreat into the schiltrons for protection, but the pike formations were locked tight, and there was nowhere to go. English cavalry, which had been circling uselessly looking for gaps, saw the Scottish archers running and cut them down in seconds. Now Wallace's schiltrons stood alone. 4 massive circles of spearmen with no missile support, no cavalry screen, and 2,000 English longbowmen hammering them with arrows at point-blank range. The pikemen couldn't advance. The formations would collapse. They couldn't retreat. They were surrounded. They couldn't even crouch or take cover. The pikes had to stay vertical, or the English cavalry would charge through the gaps. All they could do was stand in perfect formation and die. The betrayal happened in stages, which somehow made it worse. First to leave was John Comyn of Badenoch, one of Scotland's most powerful nobles, commanding approximately 300 mounted men-at-arms. Comyn had spent the night arguing with Wallace about tactics, questioning the defensive position, suggesting retreat into the highlands. When the English longbows opened fire at 10 a.m., Comyn watched the slaughter for exactly 30 minutes, timed by English chroniclers who witnessed the flight, before turning his entire division around and riding north without engaging once. His departure was orderly, almost casual, as if he were leaving a tournament rather than abandoning 10,000 men to death. John Stewart of Bonkle, commanding another 200 cavalry, held his position for 5 more minutes after Comyn fled. Stewart was reportedly torn. He'd sworn personal loyalty to Wallace, but watching Comyn's forces disappear made the calculus clear. If the senior nobles were fleeing, staying meant dying for a lost cause. At 10:35 a.m., Stewart gave the order to withdraw. His men didn't even pretend to charge the English lines. They simply turned and followed Comyn north. Within minutes, the remaining Scottish cavalry, fragmented units without clear command, dissolved in panic. Some nobles stayed initially, shouting orders to hold position. But when their own retainers started deserting, they had no choice but to follow or be left alone. By 10:45 a.m., Wallace's entire cavalry force had evaporated. 1,000 mounted men, gone in 15 minutes. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about this betrayal. It was militarily rational and morally unforgivable in equal measure. The Scottish nobles who fled were correct in their assessment. The battle was lost. The Longbow massacre was unstoppable. Charging into English cavalry positions would accomplish nothing except adding noble casualties to the peasant dead. From a pure tactical standpoint, preserving the cavalry for future resistance made sense. But the human cost of that calculation was devastating. The Scottish archers, positioned in the gaps between schiltrons, had been holding their ground despite being outranged and outgunned. They'd stayed because Wallace's cavalry was behind them, providing psychological support and a defensive screen against English cavalry sweeps. The moment the cavalry fled, that screen disappeared. English knights, who'd been circling the battlefield looking for opportunities, saw the Scottish archers suddenly exposed and vulnerable. What happened next was a slaughter that took less than 3 minutes. Approximately 600 English cavalry charged the gaps between the schiltrons where Scottish archers stood. The archers, carrying only bows and light leather armor, had no chance in melee combat against armored knights on war horses. Some tried to run toward the schiltrons for protection, but the pike formations were too tightly packed to open gaps for retreating men. Others tried to scatter toward the woods, but mounted cavalry runs down foot soldiers like wolves hunting rabbits. English chroniclers described the killing with clinical detachment. The Scottish bowmen were hewn down where they stood, offering no resistance. Total time, under 5 minutes. Scottish archer casualties, approximately 700 of the original 800. The survivors who reached the woods were hunted down by English light cavalry over the next hour. Now Wallace's pikemen stand completely isolated. No cavalry support, no archer support, no way to counter the English longbows except to endure. The schiltrons are taking 200 arrows per minute, 12,000 arrows every hour. And there's no reinforcement coming, no tactical adaptation possible. The formations are dying in place, and every man inside them knows it. Think about that psychological torture. You're standing shoulder to shoulder with your neighbors, watching them fall with arrows in their throats, knowing you're next, unable to run because breaking formation means the cavalry kills everyone. That's not battle. That's execution dressed up as warfare. 10:50 a.m. Wallace, watching from his position behind the collapsing schiltrons, makes a desperate calculation. The cavalry is gone. The archers are dead. The pikemen are being massacred. He has no reserves, no reinforcements, no tactical options left. but the formations are still intact, damaged, bleeding, dying, but still standing in their circular pike walls. If he orders a retreat now, the schiltrons will break apart and English cavalry will slaughter everyone. If he orders them to hold, they'll die where they stand, but might buy time for survivors to escape into Calendar Wood. Wallace chooses to hold, because surrendering means watching English cavalry chase down and butcher 10,000 fleeing peasants. At least in formation, they die as soldiers rather than hunted animals. And in the next hour, those Scottish pikemen will prove that courage without support, discipline without hope, and formations without mobility are nothing but elegant ways to commit suicide on a medieval battlefield. Unleaven him. Here's where the tragedy of Falkirk becomes truly horrifying. Wallace's schiltrons didn't break, even as arrows slaughtered them by the hundreds, even as their own cavalry abandoned them, even as blood turned the boggy ground into a swamp. The formations held. This wasn't stupidity. This was discipline drilled into men who understood that breaking formation meant instant death from English cavalry. Every Scottish pikeman had been trained with one absolute rule. If you break the schiltron, everyone dies. So they didn't break. They stood shoulder to shoulder, holding their 12-foot pikes at the perfect angle, watching their friends collapse with arrows in their throats, waiting for orders that never came because their commanders had fled. Grim chronicles from English observers describe the scene in clinical horror. The Scots stood as trees in a forest, falling not until death took them. One account mentions a Scottish spearman who stood upright with 7 arrows in his body, still gripping his pike until an 8th arrow finally dropped him. Another describes a section of schiltron where every man in the front 3 ranks was dead. But the formation held because the men behind them physically couldn't move forward through the bodies. Modern historians estimate that Wallace's army absorbed 50,000 to 70,000 arrows during the first hour of sustained archery. That's more arrows than there were men in the entire Scottish army. The mathematical impossibility of survival became reality. And still, the schiltrons held, because Wallace had trained them too well. The discipline Wallace drilled into his pikemen at Stirling Bridge had been absolute and uncompromising. For months before that battle, he'd trained common farmers and craftsmen to stand in formation under simulated cavalry charges, teaching them that individual survival meant nothing. Only the collective survival of the schiltron mattered. Break formation, and everyone dies. Hold formation, and everyone lives. That training had worked perfectly at Stirling Bridge, where English cavalry shattered itself against Scottish pikes. But at Falkirk, that same training had become a death sentence. Inside the schiltrons, men are dying in ways that defy description. Arrows strike from above at 45-degree angles, punching through shoulders, necks, and skulls. A pikeman in the 3rd rank takes an arrow through his right eye. He staggers but doesn't fall because the men around him are pressed too tightly to let him collapse. He stands there, dead on his feet, held upright by the shoulders of living men who can't move to let him drop. Another soldier takes an arrow through the throat. Blood sprays across the faces of the men beside him. He tries to scream but can only gurgle, drowning in his own blood, while maintaining his grip on his pike because muscle memory is stronger than death. Here's what makes this genuinely insane. The schiltrons can't adapt. Medieval pike formations operate on a simple principle: maintain the wall of spears, and cavalry can't penetrate. But that principle assumes you're fighting cavalry. Against archery, the formation's strength becomes its weakness. The men are packed so tightly, less than 2 feet between soldiers, that dodging is impossible. Taking cover means crouching, which lowers the pikes and creates gaps. Raising shields means dropping the pikes. Every defensive instinct these men possess would save their individual lives, but destroy the formation. So they suppress those instincts and stand still while physics and geometry kill them. The casualty rate is beyond medieval comprehension. In a normal battle, armies broke and routed when they hit 10% to 15% casualties. The psychological breaking point where soldiers stop believing victory is possible. Wallace's schiltrons are approaching 30% casualties and still holding. Think about that. 3 out of every 10 men are dead or dying, and the formations haven't wavered. The front ranks are decimated. The bodies are piling so high that soldiers in the rear ranks are standing on corpses to maintain formation spacing. Blood is ankle deep in some sections. Men are slipping in the viscera of their friends, falling, being trampled, and still trying to raise their pikes back into position. 11:15 a.m. An English observer, a knight named Robert de Clifford, later writes in his chronicle, "I had seen men die in war before. I had seen them cut down by swords, trampled by horses, burned in sieges. But I had never seen men simply stand and accept death as if it were duty. The Scots did not flee. They did not beg. They stood in their circles and died like statues. And it was the most terrible and beautiful thing I have ever witnessed." But here's what Clifford didn't understand. The Scottish pikemen weren't choosing to die out of nobility or courage. They were trapped by their own training. Breaking formation meant facing English cavalry, 2,500 armored knights waiting just outside arrow range for exactly that moment. Staying in formation meant dying slowly from arrows. There was no third option. Wallace had created a tactical paradox where survival was impossible, and the only choice was how to die. Fast by cavalry or slow by arrows. The English longbowmen, by contrast, are firing with mechanical efficiency. They've settled into a rhythm: knock, draw, loose, repeat. 6 arrows per minute, per man. They're not aiming at individuals. They're firing into zones, elevation shots that arc over 250 yards and plunge down into the packed formations. The arrows fall like rain, and the schiltrons are umbrellas that don't work. Some archers have begun targeting specific sections of formations that show signs of wavering, concentrating fire to collapse isolated portions. Others are experimenting with fire arrows, wrapping cloth around the shafts, soaking them in pitch, lighting them, and watching them arc through the air like meteors before embedding in Scottish soldiers or the wooden stakes anchoring the formations. 11:25 a.m. The northernmost schiltron, the formation that had taken the most concentrated arrow fire, finally shows signs of breaking. Not from loss of discipline, but from simple mathematics. Approximately 900 of its original 2,500 men are dead or too wounded to stand. The rear ranks are stepping forward to replace casualties in the front. But there aren't enough men left to maintain the circular integrity. Gaps are opening. The formation is thinning. And Edward's cavalry commanders, watching from 400 yards away, see it happening. They signal their knights. Mount up. Prepare to charge. The killing is about to change from systematic to savage. 11:30 a.m. William Wallace stood somewhere behind his dying schiltrons. Historical sources disagree on his exact position, and watched his tactical masterpiece become his greatest failure. The schiltron had won at Stirling Bridge because it forced the English to fight on Wallace's terms, in terrain where cavalry couldn't maneuver. But here, at Falkirk, Edward had simply refused to fight on those terms. He'd let his longbowmen do what medieval commanders almost never did: win the battle through missile fire alone, without glory, without chivalry, without even risking his cavalry. Wallace must have understood in that moment that everything had changed. Medieval warfare, for centuries, had been dominated by mounted knights. Men in armor who charged with lances and decided battles through shock combat. Archers were support troops, useful for harassing enemies, but never decisive. Stirling Bridge had proven that disciplined infantry with pikes could stop cavalry. But Falkirk proved something even more revolutionary. Archers could stop pike infantry. And the implications were staggering. If longbows could break schiltrons at range, then every defensive formation in medieval Europe was suddenly obsolete. Castles could be defended. Open field battles could be won by whoever had more archers. Cavalry, the backbone of feudal military power, was about to become secondary to men with wooden bows. Wallace had accidentally forced Edward to invent combined arms warfare. The coordinated use of cavalry, infantry, and archers to compensate for each other's weaknesses. And that invention would dominate European battlefields for the next 200 years, until gunpowder made everything obsolete again. But right now, at 11:30 a.m. on July 22nd, 1298, all Wallace knew was that his men were dying. His plan had failed, and he had no way to stop it. The casualty figures Wallace could see from his position were catastrophic beyond anything medieval Scotland had experienced. Of his original 10,000 pikemen in the schiltrons, approximately 4,000 were dead or too wounded to fight. Let that sink in. 45% casualties in 90 minutes, without the English even reaching Scottish lines. The northern schiltron had effectively ceased to exist as a combat formation. Fewer than 800 men still standing out of an original 2,500. And those survivors were scattered in broken clusters rather than a coherent circle. The other three formations were holding but deteriorating rapidly, taking 200 arrows per minute each, with no way to return fire or take cover. Wallace had no reserves. The cavalry was gone. 1,000 nobles who'd fled north without striking a blow. The archers were dead, 700 killed in 3 minutes when English cavalry caught them exposed. His entire tactical reserve consisted of maybe 200 men who'd been assigned to guard the baggage train, and throwing them into the slaughter wouldn't change the outcome. He was watching 10,000 men die because he designed a defensive system that couldn't adapt to a threat he hadn't anticipated. The schiltron was perfect against cavalry and useless against archery, and Edward had exploited that weakness with surgical precision. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about Wallace's mental state at this moment. He knew he'd lost before the battle even started. Not militarily. He'd positioned his forces correctly, given the information he had. He'd lost strategically, at the level of military doctrine and technological capability. Scotland didn't have longbows. Scottish military culture had never invested in archery as a decisive weapon. Even if Wallace had recognized the threat longbows posed, he couldn't have countered it because Scotland lacked the decades of training infrastructure England had built to produce 2,000 professional longbowmen. The Welsh had developed the longbow over generations of mountain warfare. Edward had conquered Wales specifically to acquire that technology and those soldiers. Scotland had neither. Wallace was fighting a war 1 generation behind the cutting edge of military innovation, and no amount of tactical brilliance could compensate for that gap. It's like bringing swords to a gunfight. Except the guns won't be invented for another 150 years. Longbows were that far ahead of what Scotland could field. Everything Wallace had learned at Stirling Bridge about discipline, formation fighting, using terrain, turning peasants into soldiers, was suddenly obsolete because Edward had changed the rules. 11:35 a.m. Wallace receives reports from runners who've made it back from the schiltrons. The information is fragmentary and horrifying. The northern formation has broken. Not from cowardice, but from simple math. Too many dead to maintain formation integrity. The eastern schiltron reports 60% casualties. The southern formation's commander is dead. killed by an arrow through the throat. The western schiltron is still holding but running out of men capable of standing. Every report ends the same way. We need support or we need to withdraw. Wallace has neither support to give nor any safe avenue for withdrawal. If he orders a retreat, the formations dissolve, and English cavalry runs down fleeing soldiers like hunting dogs chasing rabbits. If he orders them to hold, they die in place, but might buy time for a few hundred survivors to escape into Calendur Wood. The mathematics of defeat are becoming simple and brutal. How many men can he save? Not how many can win. That's impossible now. Here's where Wallace's leadership crystallizes into something historians will debate for 7 centuries. He doesn't order a general retreat. He doesn't try to rally his men for a counterattack he knows would fail. Instead, he makes a cold, calculated decision that saves perhaps 2,000 lives at the cost of abandoning 8,000 men to their fate. He orders the western schiltron, the formation farthest from English cavalry and closest to the woods, to break formation and run for Calendur Wood in small groups. The other 3 formations are to hold as long as possible to cover that retreat. He's sacrificing 3/4 of his army to save 1/4, and he's doing it without telling the men being sacrificed that they're bait. 11:40 a.m. The western schiltron begins its retreat, men breaking from the formation in groups of 10 and 20, sprinting for the tree line 400 yards away. Maybe 2,500 Scottish soldiers make it to the woods. Behind them, the remaining 3 schiltrons stand firm, still taking arrow fire, still dying, buying time for their comrades to escape. And William Wallace, the guardian of Scotland who'd proven at Stirling Bridge that Scotland could fight, turns his horse north and rides away from the battlefield. Not in panic, not in cowardice, but in cold calculation. He's more valuable alive as a symbol of resistance than dead as a martyr on this field. In the next 30 minutes, 6,000 Scottish soldiers will die so that their commander can survive to fight again. 12 p.m. The schiltrons were no longer intact military formations. They were clusters of exhausted, wounded men, standing in pools of blood and corpses, some still gripping their pikes out of muscle memory, most too tired or too injured to even notice the English cavalry reforming for one last charge. Edward gave the order. This time, the cavalry didn't charge to break the schiltrons. They charged to exterminate what was left of them. Knights with swords and maces systematically butchered men too wounded to resist. No quarter was given. No prisoners were taken from common soldiers. This wasn't battle anymore. This was execution. The formations had absorbed nearly 70,000 arrows over 2 hours, enough projectiles that the ground looked like a forest of wooden shafts sprouting from bodies and earth. What had been tight circles of 1,200 men were now ragged clusters of maybe 400 to 600 survivors, many wounded, all exhausted, standing among their dead because there was nowhere else to go. Here's what makes this final phase genuinely horrifying. The killing was systematic and professional. English knights weren't rage-killing. They were clearing the battlefield with the same efficiency as workers cleaning a slaughterhouse. Wounded Scots were dispatched with single sword strokes. Those still standing were surrounded and killed by coordinated attacks. Edward's orders had been explicit. This wasn't a battle to be won. It was a rebellion to be ended through terror. Think about the mathematics. Approximately 6,000 Scottish soldiers were killed in 60 minutes, 100 deaths per minute. Nearly 2 per second, sustained for an entire hour. That rate of killing is almost impossible without modern weapons. Some Scottish soldiers tried to surrender, throwing down their weapons and kneeling. They were killed anyway. Dead men tell no stories, and corpses send a clearer message. The stream running through the battlefield, the West Quarter burn, became so clogged with bodies that the water stopped flowing, creating a dam of corpses. English chroniclers describe it with a mix of awe and horror. The burn ran red for a day and a night, and the stench of death could be smelled 3 miles distant. By 1 p.m., the Battle of Falkirk was over. 4 hours of combat, 10,000 Scotsmen dead, maybe more. English casualties, estimated at 2,000 total, mostly wounded. The kill ratio was beyond medieval comprehension. Nothing like this had happened in European warfare in living memory. One English knight, Sir Thomas Grey, later wrote, "I had fought in Wales, in Gascony, in Flanders. I had seen men die in war, but Falkirk was different. It wasn't war. It was harvest, and the crop was Scottish dead." William Wallace survived Falkirk, but the man who rode away wasn't the same man who'd won at Stirling Bridge. He fled north with maybe 50 soldiers, riding through the night until the horses were exhausted. On August 4th, 1298, just 13 days after Falkirk, Wallace resigned as Guardian of Scotland. The official reason was to allow fresh leadership. The real reason was that every noble who'd fled the battlefield was blaming Wallace for the disaster. He'd been Guardian for 10 months. In that time, he'd won one battle and lost another that killed 10,000 Scots. The nobility, who'd never fully accepted a commoner as their leader, replaced him with Robert Bruce and John Comyn. Wallace disappeared from Scottish records. English chronicles mention him seeking audience with King Philip IV of France, begging for military aid. Philip offered diplomatic sympathy and nothing else. Wallace reportedly traveled to Rome, seeking papal intervention. The Pope issued statements supporting Scotland. Those statements accomplished nothing. He returned to Scotland and resumed guerrilla warfare, but the scale was humiliatingly small. He led raids with 30 to 50 men, attacking supply convoys, burning outposts. Edward had placed a 300-mark bounty on Wallace's head, and the price made him toxic. Scottish nobles who might have sheltered him decided his friendship wasn't worth the risk. By 1303, Scotland was effectively conquered. Robert Bruce had submitted to Edward. Most nobles had sworn fealty. Wallace was the last man still resisting, and his resistance had become symbolic rather than strategic. A middle finger to English occupation that accomplished nothing except keeping him alive and free. August 5th, 1305. Wallace was captured near Glasgow, betrayed by John de Menteith, a Scottish knight negotiating with English authorities. On August 23rd, he was tried for treason at Westminster Hall. Wallace's defense was simple. "I cannot be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." English law didn't care. The execution was designed to terrorize. He was hanged, but cut down before death. Disemboweled while still conscious. Beheaded. Quartered. His head was mounted on London Bridge. His limbs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. The execution achieved the opposite of its intended effect. Living, Wallace had been increasingly irrelevant. Dead, he became a martyr, whose memory proved impossible to suppress. Within a year, Robert Bruce would murder John Comyn, declare himself King of Scotland, and restart the rebellion explicitly invoking Wallace's name. Falkirk didn't just kill 10,000 Scots. It killed the medieval cavalry charge as the dominant tactic in European warfare. Edward the Hun had demonstrated something revolutionary. Coordinated missile fire from massed longbowmen could break any infantry formation, and cavalry could then exploit the chaos without catastrophic losses. This became English tactical doctrine for 150 years. At Crécy in 1346, English longbowmen slaughtered French cavalry in almost identical fashion. The French charged 15 separate times, over 6 hours. 15 times they were shattered by arrow fire. French casualties, 12,000 dead. English casualties, fewer than 200. At Poitiers in 1356, same result. At Agincourt in 1415, it happened again. French knights charging into arrow storms and dying in heaps. The French eventually called English archers the most accursed thing in the world, because there was no honor in being shot to death from 200 yards by peasants with wooden bows. Here's what makes this pattern insane. The French knew what would happen. After Crécy, French commanders understood intellectually that charging Longbowmen was suicide. But feudal culture demanded that knights fight honorably in close combat. Adapting meant admitting peasant archers were militarily superior to armored knights, admission that destroyed the social hierarchy, justifying nobility. So the French kept charging, and the English kept killing them for 117 years. Here's the historical irony Edward the Worm never understood. Falkirk won him the battle, but lost him the war. By 1304, Scotland appeared conquered. But Wallace's execution turned him into a martyr whose memory became more powerful than his living leadership ever was. Edward the First died in 1307, still trying to crush Scottish resistance. His son, Edward II, inherited the quagmire and promptly lost everything at Bannockburn in 1314. Robert Bruce had studied Falkirk for 16 years. He knew exactly how Edward I had won, and he designed a battlefield where those tactics couldn't work. He positioned his schiltrons on marshy terrain that channeled English cavalry into killing zones, with woods preventing Longbowmen from finding clear angles. The English cavalry charged and became bogged down. Longbowmen couldn't establish firing positions. Bruce's schiltrons advanced and pushed the English back into the Bannockburn. English casualties, 11,000 dead, including 700 knights. Scottish casualties, fewer than 500. The kill ratio from Falkirk had been completely reversed. By 1328, England formally recognized Scottish independence. Edward I had spent 30 years, hundreds of thousands of pounds, and tens of thousands of lives trying to hold Scotland. He'd won nearly every major battle, and he'd lost the war completely. Sometimes the most decisive victories guarantee eventual defeat. You can kill an army, but you can't kill an idea. The idea that Scotland could resist, proven at Stirling Bridge, martyred at Falkirk, became more powerful than any military victory could suppress. The battlefield at Falkirk was left to rot. The dead lay where they fell, 10,000 Scottish corpses exposed to the elements, scavenged by crows and wolves. Local peasants eventually buried some in mass graves. Others were left to bleach into bones. For decades, travelers reported the smell of death clinging to the valley. Farmers unearthed skulls and rusted weapons. Children found arrowheads embedded in trees. Today, there's no monument at Falkirk marking where 10,000 men died. No cemetery, no memorial stones, no visitor center. The exact location is disputed. 700 years of development have erased any battlefield archaeology. Wallace has statues. Stirling Bridge has monuments. Bannockburn has a heritage center. But Falkirk, the battle that killed the most Scots in a single day during the Wars of Independence, is forgotten except by specialists. Maybe that's fitting. Falkirk wasn't a glorious last stand. It was a slaughter, the result of bringing pikes to an arrow fight, of nobility abandoning commoners, of medieval tactics colliding with early modern warfare. There's no romance in what happened there. Just blood, mud, and the mathematical certainty that when 2,000 Longbowmen fired 12,000 arrows per minute into tightly packed formations, everyone dies. The men who stood in those schiltrons deserve to be remembered. They held formation while arrows punched through their bodies. They trusted commanders who abandoned them. They believed Scotland was worth dying for, and they were proven both right and heartbreakingly wrong. 7 centuries later, traffic drives over ground where 10,000 men bled out on July 22, 1298. Shoppers park their cars on fields where schiltron stood and died. Houses are built where arrows fell like rain. And almost no one knows. Maybe we should. Maybe forgetting Falkirk means forgetting what war actually costs. Not the strategic outcomes or tactical innovations, but the individual lives of men who believed their cause was worth dying for and were proven both right and tragically, devastatingly wrong.